In this week's column, in this week's Raja Mandala, you've almost taken a sort of look back and look forward. An ideas look back at the last 10 years of Indian diplomacy, some of the big things that have changed in terms of how India views the world and perhaps even the world views India as a result. The connections and things that have been, if not made, certainly deepened during this time. So the first thing is that, you know, there's two ways of looking at it. You make this idea, there's a very interesting idea that things we think of as regions are actually not geographical at all. They're negotiated in political and their narratives, is a popular word right now. How do you see India as having done this? Because in one sense, it would look like the connections it has made were also transgressions. That, you're in the Indo-Pacific as perhaps part of the Quad with, your perhaps your military strength coming from Russia or Russian purchased arms. Or, being able to manage the Middle East as well as Israel so well, things like that. How do you see what has enabled this kind of connection building?
Yeah. I think, in the last column, when we talked about the new language, that Indian foreign policy has begun to use a vocabulary, a terminology that was really new, different from the traditional Indian diplomacy and foreign policy. So this time we thought we look at, how the geographic categories, the regions, how we think about regions, how that has evolved. And partly because of our interests and partly because of the external circumstances. So the constitution of the regions has clearly, has evolved. Both in our interests have changed as well as the external circumstances have changed. We started with Katchatheevu essentially just to, connect to what is going on. But one big change that has happened, for example, is the island states. No, well, Katchatheevu is a whole different story here. We're not going into that. But the fact that we spend so much time on Maldives, for example, or we're interested in Mauritius. We built a facility there along with Mauritius. We interested in the Pacific Island because of the competition with China in the maritime domain. So protecting, your interest in island states has become a major part of, because today is an age of, as Asia has opened up its economies, that today you have trade is a very important issue. If you have trade, then you need good navies. And once you have navies, access to island states has become important. Therefore, protecting your stakes in the Indian Ocean islands or raising stakes in faraway islands has become part of the competition with China. So I think, so in a way, that has changed the priorities, the kind of amount of time and space we devote to islands. And then we've discovered that we have our own islands. Yeah. That actually, both Andaman and Nicobar to the east of the South Indian Peninsula and Lakshadweep to the west, for a long time I remained neglected. Delhi was not even paying attention. They were just largely left under the Home Ministry. You said, look, closed, don't let anybody come in. While you saw actually China develop these islands on its own coast into massive facilities. So I think there is that idea of developing your own islands. And these islands, that brings to your question, which is really part of a region we never thought of in the past, which is the Indo-Pacific. Yeah. We know the Indian Ocean and Pacific were two different regions. But it was Shinzo Abe who came to India and said, look, these two are together because India and Japan must work together to limit the dangers posed by Chinese expansionism. He didn't put it in those words, but he was essentially saying, don't think of it just as one small region, but it's actually a big region, and that the two oceans are connected. So the idea of Indo-Pacific was planted by the Japanese, but we were initially very reluctant to engage with it because we thought this is really anti-China. But as our problems with China mounted, we have actually adopted the term fully a decade after Shinzo Abe raised it in our parliament, because things started getting worse with China. The competition with China started growing. Therefore, you embrace the idea now of Indo-Pacific. But if we look at it, if you think of this region, it's actually the region where the British Empire dominated. In some ways, so this is not a new region. In some ways, it's going back to the old region. Say, because the British Empire had influence from east coast of Africa to southern coast of China. Hong Kong was under Indian control, and you had Aden was part of India. You had large number of bases, facilities all across the Indian Ocean. So there is a cyclical thing as well as what the terms you use and terms you change. So geography, we are arguing, geographic terminology, they're all politically constituted, and that these are not just what a school teacher geography class told us, that these are seven,
Yeah.
the 6 continents, 5 oceans, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, you've covered. Another thing, everyone should read the column. You also take this sort of this idea and we apply it to Eurasia, which was started out as a Russian conception, is now evolving from that with the pipelines through the Middle East and post-Abraham Accords. But a lot of this, one of the things that has been said is that now that there is I mean, the two wars going on, especially the one in Ukraine in that sense, and then of course China being more and more assertive and very much backing certain horses and all these as a great power would, or as a major power would. Do you see that the fact that India's managed to actually traverse old rivalries within the people we're dealing with? Do you think that's going to become harder and harder? We've so far, by most accounts, done a fairly good job post these conflicts. If conflicts last and they deepen, especially if there's sort of a renewed Cold War.
No, for example, the Ukraine war, if you look, is really between Russia and Europe. Because Russia says it wants a sphere of influence in Central Europe. Europeans say, look, this is a violation of sovereignty, is a threat to the whole of Europe. So historically, our relationship with Russia, so we kept silent. We've not really criticized Russia for what it has, violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. But what we have done in the last few years is really to step up our relationships with Europe. While we disagree on the formulation of Ukraine, our engagement with France has gone up. We do buy more weapons from France. In the old days, it was all Russia. We increasing our trade with Europe, because Europe might be small and vulnerable, but it is the world's second largest economy as a collective. It has enormous things to offer for a country like India. So therefore, you are balancing it by stepping up the economic and political security engagement with Europe. So Europe, which was never of much of a priority for independent India, today we're spending a lot of time on Europe. Earlier, we should just deal with France and Britain and Germany. But today, smaller countries, we say we had many summits with the countries of the Nordic region.
Yeah.
The Nordics are very good in green technologies, so we work with them on the green transition. We're working with Southern European countries, for example, Italy and Greece. We're working with the Caucasus. So I think the time and energy we devote to Europe and different parts of Europe, that's also grown. So that is a change. So while the Ukraine issue remains there, our stakes are spread far more widely than during the Cold War, when we were really with the Russians and against the Europeans. Similarly, I would say in the Gulf, today what used to think of the Middle East today is getting more complicated. The rise of the Gulf, we've talked about it before, the Gulf money is changing the economic geography of the region. We're talking about an economic corridor. For example, we have now 21 ships deployed outside the Red Sea, attacking piracy. So in the old days, we saw Africa, the Middle East, the Indian Ocean were all different categories. But today we see them as more connected, integrated. So our geographic understanding of the Western neighborhood of India, that's also changed.
So, this, but do you see this before the last question I'd asked, do you see this as just as these constructions have been politically determined now, and we are very much part, in fact, one would argue more than before India, as part of shaping these new ideas, that they will also change? And do you see that happen? I mean, how stable are these, say, for the next 10 years coming forward for India's planning?
Yeah, I think India's ambition should not be to see whether they're stable or not, but whether we go up the hierarchy.
Yeah.
That our weight and engagement with each of these regions should be higher, so that even if they're reshaped, our weight and salience will grow. So, for example, I mean, take South Asia. South Asia did not exist till the mid-1980s. So we formed the SARC in the mid-80s. That time, India was suspicious of SARC. Pakistan was suspicious of SARC. But SARC has not gone anywhere. But the question of India's relationship with its neighbors will always be there. So the question is not whether we get hung up on the idea of South Asia, or do you say, look, how do I make my market more accessible to Bangladesh? How do I make, how can we facilitate Nepal's trade with India? How do we facilitate Indian investments in Nepal and, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives? I think those should be the issues. So therefore, thinking about deeper integration should be our choice rather than either moaning, oh my God, look at South Asia, nothing is happening, but nothing is stopping you from improving ties with the rest of the region. So I think we should have, wherever there's an opportunity, we should move forward.
So one final question. This is actually from a letter writer. Is only goes by Shantanu S. So I'm going to paraphrase this question a bit. But it's a very interesting question. We looked at the last two videos as well as read the columns. So thank you for engaging. And his basic thing was that the basic question I'll paraphrase is that, fact that there's been political engagement and political priority to diplomacy in a way that we haven't seen in recent memory, at least perhaps since Nehru, with in the last 10 years under Prime Minister Modi, has been, you could argue, a good thing, just because of the engagement, the political capital, the political will to do, say, historic hesitations overcome that we've talked about before, the PM spirit. But now when you see a Katchatheevu or something happening, is it also becoming a problem that everything is so hyper politicized? We say it in other spheres of Indian in politics now, but is it also a problem for India's external orientation? Sometimes we saw it a bit with Bangladesh. No one officially said anything, but there were, and I mean there are still things going on in Bangladesh. In fact, by the BNP, of course, not Sheikh Hasina.
Yeah. No, there is always a danger, hyper nationalism, hyper sense of projecting yourself as some kind of God's gift to humanity. There's always will be problems. I mean, we've seen how China has tripped up by actually fighting with its neighbors. Today, it finds, suddenly all its neighbors are drawing close to the US. While 10 years ago, everybody seemed to be in love with China because China was a good place to go to. They were happy to have Chinese investments. But because of Chinese ambitions, territorially or otherwise, or to dominate other countries, has produced a backlash. So I think we should really learn from that. I mean, that it's very easy to lose your gains if you're seen as a bully or as a hegemon. Then countries will react. Even the smallest countries don't want to sacrifice their sovereignty just because you think you are the greatest thing in the world. So I think the Chinese experience, where they've lost their neighborhood, should be a good example for us. So I think tempering some of the hyper-nationalism is very, very important. And I think we've seen in the Maldives case, the government was quite careful in keeping the arguments moderate and correct, while the social media went crazy, expressing, contempt and condescension to a small country. So that's not good. But this is not whether the government can control it or not. We don't know. But the fact is that everybody has a sense of their nationhood, their sovereignty. So if you want to gain, if you want to win, the important thing is the story is the Indian foreign policy. The principal objective is still how to win friends and influence the world, not to tell everyone how great you are. So I think, but for nationalist parties, I think that finding that balance is important. In the case of Sri Lanka, of course, what I was saying about Katchatheevu today, I think India was the country that helped Sri Lanka during the crisis. So the question then becomes, can the BJP, while raising Tamil nationalism in the election campaign, also manage the complex relationship with Colombo, which is historically burdened by the Tamil factor? So I think the skill, so this requires both containing these kind of initiatives while preventing ultranationalism from damaging our policies to the neighbors.
Great, sir. Thank you so much. I hope Shantanu is happy. Everyone read the piece. It's on the IndianExpress.com. Should be in the description wherever you're watching this, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much, sir.